So the Supreme Court today has constituted an expert committee led by Justice R.V. Ravindran to explore the Pegasus issue, to investigate the Pegasus issue in India. Along with him are Alok Joshi, who's a former IPS officer, and Dr. Sandeep Oberoi, who's the chairman of the subcommittee of International Organization of Standardization of International Electrotechnical Commission. A bit of a mouthful that. This committee also has three technical members: Dr. Naveen Kumar Chaudhary from the National Forensic Science University, and Dr. Prabhakaran from the Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham in Kerala, and Dr. Ashwini Anil Gupte from Mumbai. Now, why was this committee constituted? Essentially, the multiple petitions have been filed in the Indian Supreme Court from journalists, from activists, from the Editors Guild of India, from Professor Jagdeep Chokar, who's my uncle, but he's also the co-founder of the Association for Democratic Reforms, from the Software Freedom Law Center, uh, essentially challenging the surveillance that the Indian government has allegedly conducted. This follows news reports a few months ago, um, where it was disclosed that about 150 odd people in India had been surveilled, or maybe 300 people in India had been surveilled using the Pegasus software. Now, Pegasus isn't just a software; it's a collection of software that has identifies exploits in apps that you might have on your device, and depending on the vulnerability in that app, it infiltrates your phone, and then once it is in the operating system of your phone, it can basically access all your files, it can access all your calls, it can record, it can send this information out. So it's a surveillance software, but more importantly, it's also an implantation software that can be used to put uh, so-called evidence on your device, right? So these were people who usually act in public interest who were being surveilled, and the suspicion immediately went to the government of India because the NSO group, which has the Pegasus software, essentially only sells it to governments. So the Supreme Court had six reasons or six, seven reasons why they essentially constituted this committee. One was that they believe that the right to privacy and freedom of speech has been impacted according to the petitions, and that needs to be examined. Um, and the entire citizenry of the country is also affected because of a chilling effect. If you can't trust the messages or the calls that you're making or the messages that you're sending, that they're not being surveilled, then you maybe message less, or you might be careful about what you say, and that's basically having a chilling effect on your fundamental right to free speech. Additionally, it was very clear that there was no clear stand taken by the government of India on this issue. They neither confirmed the usage of Pegasus nor did they deny it. They just kept saying there was no unauthorized surveillance, but they never said that there was no authorized surveillance to use Pegasus as well. And if it was authorized, then obviously there's a question about the kind of people that they're being surveilled and why they're being surveilled. So also there are global entities that have taken cognizance of the Pegasus reports that have come out. So it's a serious issue, even though the government of India was trying to play down and even belittle the newspaper reports. From about the petitioners, they said that these are people who were trying to basically create sensationalism um, around surveillance. So the government of India did not exactly respond to the complaints that were being made, but they tried various tactics like belittling petitioners, like belittling the reports that had come out. And so, the government, the court did take cognizance that the government has neither confirmed nor denied the usage of Pegasus. There's also a concern by the court that foreign agencies are involved in placing citizens of India under surveillance, and that there were allegations that state governments could also be a party to the rights deprivation of citizens. That's what the court said, right? So essentially, this committee has to examine whether Pegasus was used or not, how it was used, um, and give recommendations or its findings to the court for it to proceed. And hopefully, we might see the formation of a surveillance law in this country. But I think one thing that the court did take cognizance of was this argument of national security. And that's an interesting one because national security is something that all of us who love our country will sort of take a step back, because if revealing certain information hampers the national security of the country, then we're not likely to say that, okay, this information should be revealed. And that's what the government used. They basically said that if terrorists find out that Pegasus was being used against them by the Indian government, then they'll take preventive action. That those who are likely to be intercepted will take preemptive and corrective steps. Um, so what the Supreme Court are very clear on this. They said that citing national security concerns does not mean that the state gets a free pass every time the spectra of national security is raised. Also, even though the court said that it does not want to hamper national security, they said that the mere invocation of national security by the state does not render the court a mute spectator. So they were cognizant of the fact that there was no specific denial to the allegations that were made in the petitions in the Supreme Court, and that it only been a broad omnibus denial, which cannot be sufficient. So it said it can't be sufficient. I think this case is really, really important. As Shamdevan said in the very first hearing, using spyware against your own citizens is unconstitutional, and it constitutes a war by a state against its own citizens. I think we also have to take into account something that Colin Gonsalves, the petitioner for the Software Freedom Law Center, said, that there are 5,000 surveillance orders that are signed by the Home Secretary each month in India. The scale at which surveillance is taking place is massive, and there's very little information and very little oversight available there. So we need independent oversight of surveillance. Um, Again, it's also important to remember the fact that who was being surveyed away, the journalists, activists, even people working in the Supreme Court. A former Supreme Court judge, his, his number was allegedly a part of the list. But figuring out whether Pegasus was being used or not becomes a bit tricky, because a technical analysis itself won't help. Pegasus is the most vile of software. It's got a zero-click exploit. You can't detect it being installed. It's in some instances a missed call on WhatsApp initially when the first instance came out 2 years ago. Missed call on WhatsApp was used to detect or was how it was being installed. It's even after it has been installed, it's very, very difficult to detect. The thing is, Pegasus is often centrally controlled. That the NSO group knows which numbers are being surveilled, and a log of some numbers that was revealed, it seems, has led to this allegation that so many people were being surveilled in India. But outside of that, there is really no means of finding out, and it only takes a very, very technical entity like the Citizen Lab in Canada to be able to determine whether Pegasus was being used or not. All in all, the way I look at it is that Pegasus is very harmful for the internet. It's not just a surveillance software, it's an implantation software. So it's harmful for people. You will not trust the devices that you're using. We all keep information that makes us vulnerable on our devices. But also from a country's perspective, countries can use it without detection. And they can use it against their own citizens. They can use it against other countries. So what this means when you have software like Pegasus and more such cyber weapons being used, you'll essentially come to a situation where countries will start firewalling themselves, that you will not be able to allow the entry of data from outside the country or the exfiltration of data from your country to another. And so what you'll end up with is a balkanized internet where something like the Chinese internet, which is highly restrictive, but all under the guise of protecting the country and protecting the citizens. So we do need global action in order to prevent this balkanization, because it's the global internet that we have today, and that's the global internet that we want. Now that the committee's been constituted, I was just thinking about what are the questions that the committee should ask. Firstly, because a technical analysis is not really going to help, because the competence, it doesn't really seem as if there are people of the kind of people that are there at Citizen Lab would be able to do the kind of forensic examination. So it's not very clear whether, from a technical perspective, they'll actually be able to determine. It's also not clear whether citizens who have allegedly been surveilled will hand over their devices for this kind of investigation. I think they might want to call folks from the Citizen Lab to depose to determine the extent of Pegasus surveillance in India and the kind of surveillance that has specifically taken place. But outside of that, I think it's important to follow the money, because it allegedly is about $55,000 to penetrate into one mobile phone using Pegasus. And so when vast amount of money has been spent, I think it's important to follow that money trail, because it would have been spent by the government and it would have been sanctioned. So I think the committee should interview government secretaries and find out whether the purchase of Pegasus was sanctioned. uh, Perhaps the purchases of our investigating agencies, of the Enforcement Directorate, of the Intelligence Bureau, of RNAW, might also want to be examined, to determine whether they bought the software. Again, we don't know whether this would have gone through multiple loops under multiple headers, but following the money is important, because money would have gone to the Israeli organization, which is the NSO group. um, I think it's also important for the committee to examine the liability of the state when it uses such software. Um, you know, uh, in my opinion, usage of software like Pegasus on citizens, without just cause, without sufficient evidence to back the need for that, should frankly amount to treason, um, because it's being done by a government, right? Lastly, I think what we need to do is identify mechanisms to prevent such things from happening. Even if they aren't able to detect if the government bought Pegasus, perhaps the committee could also identify and share recommendations to bring accountability to surveillance. Remember, there are 5,000 orders that are being sanctioned, which means, I mean, each month by the Home Secretary, which means 500 orders a day. Think about, sorry, which means about 100 or a little over 100 orders a day. Uh, just think of, the kind of application of mind that is possible in those instances when you're sanctioning that many orders. So all in all, I think we do need some kind of reform, some kind of an approach where we have confidence that such software is not being used against us as citizens. Uh, Thank you for listening in, and if you found this useful, please do subscribe to MediaNama.